Imagine a room in the city of Ugarit. It is the year 1185 before the Common Era. Outside, the sky isn't blue. It is a bruised purple, choked with the smoke of the neighboring coastal towns already in flames. On the horizon, ships are appearing. Not the merchant vessels of friends, but the high-prowed warships of ghosts. In this room, a scribe is working with frantic precision. He isn't writing a poem or a prayer. He is writing a scream. He presses the reed into the damp clay, recording the words of a king who knows his world is ending. "My father," the tablet reads, "the enemy ships are here. The cities are burned. They have done evil things in my land." The scribe finishes. He places the tablet into the kiln to be fired, to be made permanent so it can survive the journey to the king of Cyprus, but the messenger never arrives. Instead, the walls of the House of Yabninu buckle. The ceiling collapses in a rain of fire. The heat of the city's destruction does the scribe's work for him. It bakes the clay into stone. But the fire that preserved the message also silenced the world that sent it. That letter sat in the ash for 3,058 years. It waited for us to find it, to brush away the dust of Syria, and to realize that the Bronze Age didn't just end. It broke, it shattered, and it left behind a chemical trail that proves our greatest strength. Our interconnection is also our greatest shadow. Welcome back to Whispered Chronicles, echoes of forgotten lore. Today, we go back to the first globalized world to find the signature of dust. We look at the chemical ghosts trapped in cave stones and the desperate ink of kings to answer a single, terrifying question. When the world is held together by 1,000 threads, what happens when the first one snaps? In 1973, French archaeologists working in the ancient port city of Ugarit, on the coast of modern-day Syria, made a discovery that still haunts those who understand its implications. They found a clay tablet in the ruins of what they called the House of Yabninu, a merchant's residence near the harbor. The tablet had been baked hard by the fire that consumed the building, not baked intentionally, as scribes would normally do to preserve important documents, but baked by accident, by the flames of destruction. The tablet contained a letter, a plea, really. It was written by the last king of Ugarit to the king of Elasia, the ancient name for Cyprus. The text is fragmentary, damaged by the same fire that preserved it, but what remains is extraordinary in its desperation. The king writes that enemy ships have been sighted, that his cities are burning, that his troops have been dispatched to the Hittite lands, and he has no defenders. Begs for help, for reinforcements, for anything. The letter was never sent. When archaeologists found it, still sitting in the house where it was written, they realized they were holding something profound. This was not a historical document recovered from an archive. This was a snapshot of the end. The scribe who wrote these words, the king who dictated them, the messenger who should have carried them to Cyprus, all of them, died before this piece of clay could be placed on a ship. The tablet survived because fire hardened it. The people did not survive because help never came. This is where we begin. Not with the grand sweep of empires, but with a whisper from ash. A final message that tells us everything about how civilizations die. They die mid-sentence. They die still hoping. They die reaching out to networks that have already collapsed, to allies who cannot help because they are dying too. The city of Ugarit was never rebuilt. Within a generation, people forgot it had ever existed. For 3,000 years, it remained buried under sand and silence until archaeologists uncovered its ruins. And in those ruins, they found hundreds of tablets just like the one from the House of Yabninu. Letters describing a world coming apart, quests for grain that would never be answered. Reports of ships on the horizon that no one could identify. The cuneiform script preserving the final confused moments of a civilization that had thought itself permanent. What happened to Ugarit happened everywhere. From Greece to Mesopotamia, from Egypt to Anatolia, the civilized world of the Late Bronze Age experienced what we now call the Bronze Age collapse, around 1200 BCE, within the span of perhaps 50 years. Nearly every major palace and city in the eastern Mediterranean was destroyed. Some were burned, some were abandoned, none recovered. This was not the fall of one kingdom. This was systems failure on a civilizational scale. To understand what was lost, you need to understand what the Bronze Age had become. By 1200 BCE, this was not a collection of isolated kingdoms. This was the first globalized economy in human history. In 1982, sponge divers off the coast of Turkey discovered a shipwreck near a place called Uluburun. The ship had gone down around 1300 BCE, just a century before the collapse. When archaeologists excavated it, they found something astonishing. The cargo manifest of that single vessel reads like an inventory of the entire known world. There was copper from Cyprus, 10 tons of it, cast into ingots shaped like oxides. There was tin from Afghanistan, the only significant source in the region, essential for making bronze. There was ebony from Africa, ivory from Syria, amber from the Baltic, which means it had traveled over 2,000 miles over land before being loaded onto this ship. There were jars of glass beads from Egypt, where glassmaking was a closely guarded state secret. There were weapons, tools, jewelry. There were raw materials and finished goods. There was a golden scarab bearing the name of Nefertiti. One ship, one cargo. One snapshot of an integrated economic system that spanned 3 continents. The Bronze Age world worked because it was connected. Copper and tin, the 2 metals needed to make bronze, are rarely found in the same location. To have bronze, you needed trade routes, you needed merchant ships, you needed diplomatic agreements between kingdoms. You needed the Hittites in Anatolia to maintain their control over tin routes from the east. You needed the Cypriots to mine copper and ship it west. You needed the Mycenaean Greeks to provide ships and security. You needed Egypt to provide grain when harvests failed elsewhere. The palace archives we have recovered from this period are filled with letters between kings. They called each other brother. They sent gifts of gold and lapis lazuli, of horses and women. But beneath the diplomatic niceties, what they were doing was managing a system. They were coordinating the flow of resources across thousands of miles. They were maintaining the networks that made civilization possible. One of the Amarna letters, found in Egypt and dating to the 14th century BCE, contains a complaint from the king of Alatia to the pharaoh. The Cypriots had sent a shipment of copper. The Egyptians had sent back an insultingly small amount of silver in return. The letter is stern, almost threatening. It details previous exchanges, quantities agreed upon, expectations violated. This is not primitive barter. This is sophisticated international commerce with credit systems, exchange rates, and diplomatic consequences for breach of contract. Another letter, from a Hittite king to a vassal ruler, discusses the iron trade. Iron was new technology in the Bronze Age, rare and precious. The Hittites controlled the secrets of its production. The letter mentions that the king would send iron weapons, but only a few, because the furnaces were not producing enough yet. This is industrial policy. This is strategic resource management. The palace at Pylos in Greece kept extensive records written in Linear B, the earliest form of written Greek. These tablets, baked hard when the palace burned, show us the administrative machinery of Bronze Age government. There are lists of sheep allocated to religious festivals, records of bronze tools distributed to craftsmen, registers of rowers assigned to warships, inventories of grain stored in palace warehouses. One tablet simply lists the word deficit next to grain stores, suggesting that even before the end, the system was running short. All of this complexity, all of this interdependence, made the Bronze Age world prosperous. It also made it fragile. When one link in the chain broke, when one kingdom fell, the consequences cascaded. The Uluburun ship carried cargo from a dozen different regions because the Bronze Age economy required a dozen different regions to function. If any one of those regions collapsed, if tin stopped flowing from Afghanistan, or copper stopped coming from Cyprus, or grain stopped arriving from Egypt, the entire system seized up. This is what makes the Bronze Age collapse different from other historical catastrophes. This was not invasion or plague or earthquake, though all of those played roles. This was the simultaneous failure of every interconnected part of a complex system. And once it started failing, there was no way to stop it. The letters from Ugarit that survived tell us the sequence. First came reports of trouble in distant lands. Then came requests for help. Then came desperate pleas. Then came silence. The last letter from the House of Yabninu was never sent because there was no one left to send it to. The network had collapsed. The world had gone dark. For most of the 20th century, historians argued about what caused the Bronze Age collapse. Invasion was the popular theory. The Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses III left inscriptions describing battles against the Sea Peoples. Mysterious raiders who attacked by land and sea. Perhaps they had destroyed the Bronze Age world. But invasion did not explain why the collapse was so total, so universal. It did not explain why kingdoms that were never invaded also fell. It did not explain the pattern. The answer came from caves. In 2020, a team of researchers published findings from their study of speleothems, the mineral formations that grow in caves. Specifically, they had been studying stalagmites from Soreq Cave in Israel. Stalagmites grow slowly, layer upon layer, as mineral-rich water drips from the cave ceiling. Each layer preserves a chemical record of the climate when it formed. The technique is elegant. When rain falls, the water molecules contain oxygen. Oxygen comes in different isotopes, variants of the same element with different atomic weights. The ratio of these isotopes changes based on temperature and rainfall patterns. In wet years, rain contains more of the lighter oxygen-16 isotope. In dry years, the heavier oxygen-18 isotope dominates. As water drips into a cave and deposits minerals, these isotopes get locked into the growing stalagmite. By analyzing the layers, scientists can reconstruct rainfall patterns going back thousands of years with remarkable precision. What they found in Soreq Cave was a drought. Not a normal drought, not a bad decade. A megadrought, beginning around 1250 BCE and lasting for 3 centuries. The eastern Mediterranean experienced the most severe, sustained drought in the entire Holocene period. The 11,000 years since the last ice age ended, the oxygen isotope ratios showed it clearly. Year after year, decade after decade, the rain simply stopped falling. Or rather, it fell, but far less than civilizations needed to survive. The stalagmites grew, but their chemistry screamed of aridity. The layers corresponding to 1,200 BCE showed oxygenating ratios consistent with rainfall reductions of 30 to 50% below normal. Other studies confirmed it. Fossilized pollen from sediment cores, taken from the Sea of Galilee, showed the same pattern. During the Bronze Age, the pollen record indicated lush vegetation, extensive agriculture, diverse plant life. Then, right around 1200 BCE, the pollen changed. Oak and cedar declined. Olive and grain cultivation collapsed. Scrub vegetation increased. The landscape was transforming from agricultural heartland to semi-arid wasteland. Sediment cores from the Nile Delta told a similar story. The Nile flood levels, which Egyptian civilization depended on absolutely, dropped significantly during this period. Harvests failed. Egypt, the breadbasket of the ancient world, could barely feed itself. This was the signature of dust. This was environmental collapse inscribed in stone and pollen and river sediment. The Bronze Age world had not just been invaded, it had been starved. Think about what a 30% reduction in rainfall means for an agricultural civilization. It means failed crops, it means empty granaries, it means the palace storehouses that normally provided surplus to trade with other kingdoms are empty. It means the grain that would normally be traded for tin or copper or manufactured goods is no longer available. It means the ships that carried cargo across the Mediterranean have nothing to carry. It means hunger. It's not temporary shortage, but generational famine. It's not just one bad year, but 50 bad years, 100 bad years, 200 bad years. Children growing up who have never known plenty. Grandparents who remember a green world that no longer exists, who tell stories of harvests their grandchildren assume must be myths. The palace archives from Pylos recorded deficits. The letters from Ugarit mentioned food shortages. A text from the Hittite capital mentioned that the king had to import grain from Egypt, then later, desperately, from anywhere that still had surplus. These were not administrative details. These were symptoms of a world running out of food. Climate science has given us the external lore, the hard data that explains the mechanism of collapse. But it is the internal lore, the human testimony, that shows us what it felt like to live through it. The archaeology and the chemistry and the letters all tell the same story. They create what we call the stereo image, the moment when objective evidence and human experience align perfectly. When we can see both what happened and how it was experienced, the megadrought did not cause the Bronze Age collapse directly. Climate does not destroy civilizations by itself, but it breaks the systems civilizations depend on. When the rains failed, harvests failed. When harvests failed, trade failed. When trade failed, the entire interconnected Bronze Age world came apart. The drought created the conditions. Human systems, rigid and interdependent and unable to adapt, did the rest. The Sea Peoples appear in the historical record like phantoms. Egyptian inscriptions describe them as invaders, raiders who attacked by land and sea around 1200 BCE. The pharaoh Ramesses III claimed to have defeated them in battle, and the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu showed detailed reliefs of these battles. There are ships with high prows and strange warriors. There are families in ox carts, women and children traveling with the fighters. There are lists of defeated peoples with names we cannot quite identify: Peliset, Jeker, Shekelesh, Denayan. For a long time, historians imagined the Sea Peoples as barbarian invaders, northern warriors who swept down and destroyed the Bronze Age civilizations through superior military force. But this narrative never quite worked. The reliefs at Medinet Habu do not show disciplined armies. They show desperate refugees. The ox carts carry possessions, not just weapons. The women and children are not camp followers. They're families looking for somewhere to survive. The Sea Peoples were not the cause of the Bronze Age collapse. They were its product. They were ghosts of the collapse, refugees created by the same system's failure that destroyed the kingdoms they attacked. Think about what happens when a kingdom falls. The palace bureaucracy collapses. The administrative systems that distributed food and organized labor disappear. The merchants who traded for tin and copper and grain can no longer trade because there is nothing to trade with and no one to trade to. The ships that connected the Mediterranean world sit idle because there are no cargoes to carry, no ports that can pay for them. The people do not disappear. They still need to eat. They still need to survive, so they move. They take what they can carry, put their families in ox carts, and they go looking for anywhere that still has food, that still has resources, that still has functioning systems of government. They become the Sea Peoples. Some of them probably came from Mycenaean Greece, where the palaces had already fallen. Some came from Anatolia, from the collapsing Hittite Empire. Some came from the Levantan coast, from cities like Ugarit that were starving and vulnerable. They were not an invasion force. They were a migration crisis caused by cascading systems failure. When they reached Egypt, the only major Bronze Age kingdom that survived the collapse relatively intact, they attacked because they were desperate. Egypt still had grain. Egypt still had functioning cities. Egypt was where you went if you wanted to survive. Ramesses III defeated them, barely, and the reliefs at Medinet Habu commemorate that victory. But look closely at those reliefs. Look at the ox carts and the families. Those are not conquerors. Those are refugees. Some of the Sea Peoples settled on the southern coast of Canaan and became the Philistines. Archaeological evidence shows they brought with them pottery styles from the Aegean, suggesting they came from or through Greece. They built cities and adapted to their new environment. They were survivors, the remnants of destroyed civilizations trying to build something new. Others were not so fortunate. They simply disappeared from history, absorbed into the chaos of the collapse. Their names preserved only in Egyptian propaganda inscriptions. The stereotype image of the Bronze Age collapse used to be burning cities and invading armies. The reality was hunger and migration and systems failure. The Sea Peoples were not villains in this story. They were victims. They were what happens when the networks that support civilization break down and millions of people are suddenly displaced, wandering, searching for survival. We know what happened to some of the cities they attacked. Ugarit was destroyed and never rebuilt. The archaeological evidence suggests it burned. But whether the Sea Peoples burned it, or whether it was already collapsing from drought and internal failure is unclear. What is clear is that after 1200 BCE, the site was abandoned. The harbor silted up. The buildings collapsed. Sand covered everything. The same pattern repeats across the eastern Mediterranean. Mycenaean Greece was destroyed around 1200 BCE. Pylos burned. Tyrants fell. The Hittite capital at Hattusa was abandoned. The great cities of the Bronze Age, centers of power and culture and commerce, became ruins, and in their wake came silence. The most disturbing aspect of the Bronze Age collapse is not what was destroyed, it is what was forgotten. When the Mycenaean palaces fell, they took with them the administrative systems that had created Linear B, the earliest form of written Greek. Linear B was not a language of literature, it was a bureaucratic tool, used for tracking sheep and bronze tools in grain stores. When the palaces collapsed, when the bureaucracy disappeared, there was no need for Linear B anymore. The script died. For 400 years, the Greek world forgot how to write. Historians call this period the Greek Dark Ages, and the name is apt. It was dark because we have almost no written records from this time. It was dark because the archaeological evidence shows dramatic population decline. Abandonment of cities, collapse of trade networks. It was dark because the civilization that had built Mycenae and Tiryns, that had sent ships to Troy, that had created the early myths and legends that would later inspire Homer, simply forgot most of what it had known. When writing returned to Greece around 800 BCE, it came in a completely different form. The Greeks adopted the Phoenician alphabet, modified it for their language, and began again. But Linear B was gone, lost so completely that it was not deciphered until 1952, when a British architect named Michael Ventris finally cracked the code. This is not just the fall of kingdoms. This is the erasure of knowledge. This is amnesia on a civilizational scale. The same thing happened elsewhere. The Hittite Empire collapsed around 1200 BCE. The Hittite language, written in cuneiform, disappeared. When it was rediscovered by archaeologists in the early 20th century, no one could read it. It had been so thoroughly forgotten that even identifying it as an Indo-European language took decades of work. Literacy rates plummeted. Trade networks collapsed. Population declined dramatically. In Greece, archaeologists estimate the population may have dropped by as much as 75% in the century after the palaces fell. Cities were abandoned. People moved to small, scattered villages. The technology of palace construction was lost. The ability to organize large-scale labor projects disappeared. For someone living in Greece in 1000 BCE, the ruins of Mycenae would have been incomprehensible. These enormous cyclopean walls, built with stones so large that later Greeks thought they must have been constructed by giants. These complex palace structures with their sophisticated water systems and storage facilities. Later Greeks, living in small villages, looking at these ruins, could not imagine their own ancestors building such things. So they created myths instead. They said the Cyclopes had built the walls. They told stories of great kings like Agamemnon, who had led armies to Troy. They preserved fragments of memory, wrapped in legend, because actual memory was gone. The Labyrinth of Naissus on Crete, that architectural marvel, became a story about a monster and a hero rather than a record of Minoan palace design. The reality of Bronze Age civilization was so far removed from the Dark Age present that it survived only as myth. This is what total systems collapse looks like. It looks like forgetting. It looks like a civilization capable of international diplomacy and complex trade networks and written language reduced to small farming villages whose inhabitants can no longer read the inscriptions their great-grandparents left behind. The silence lasted for centuries. Slowly, painfully, civilization rebuilt. The Greek Dark Ages eventually ended. The alphabet was adopted. Trade resumed. Cities grew again. But the Bronze Age world was gone forever. What came after was fundamentally different, built on different foundations, organized around different principles. The Mediterranean did recover. Iron replaced bronze as the dominant metal technology, which made sense because iron was more common and did not require the complex international trade networks that bronze demanded. The Phoenicians became the great maritime traders, but they traded in different goods along different routes than the Bronze Age merchants had. The classical Greek city-states emerged, but they were nothing like the Mycenaean palaces. The Roman Empire would eventually unite the Mediterranean again. But Rome was a very different kind of power than Ugarit or Mycenae had been. The world that ended in 1200 BCE never came back. What replaced it was something new, built from fragments and memories and the hard lessons of collapse. We are living in the most interconnected civilization in human history. The global supply chains that bring us food and fuel and manufactured goods are more complex, more extensive, more dependent on simultaneous functioning of multiple systems than anything the Bronze Age could have imagined. Your phone contains rare earth elements mined in China, cobalt from the Congo, assembled in factories in Vietnam or India, running software written in California, connecting through infrastructure spanning every continent. The food in your refrigerator probably traveled an average of 1,500 miles to reach you. The electricity powering your lights depends on fuel sources that may have been extracted on a different continent, refined somewhere else, and transported through networks of pipes and wires and ships that span oceans. We are more dependent on global systems than the Bronze Age world ever was, which means we are more vulnerable. The Bronze Age collapse happened because interdependent systems failed simultaneously. A megadrought disrupted agriculture. Agricultural failure disrupted trade. Trade disruption collapsed economies. Economic collapse destroyed kingdoms. The destruction of kingdoms created refugee crises. Refugee migrations destabilized remaining kingdoms. The cycle fed on itself until the entire system came apart. We have our own megadroughts now. We have our own climate disruptions. We have global supply chains that depend on stable governments and secure shipping routes and predictable weather patterns. We have economic systems so interconnected that a banking crisis in one country can cascade across the world in days. We have refugee crises caused by climate change and conflict in failed states. The mechanisms of collapse have not changed. What has changed is the scale and the speed. In 1200 BCE, it took decades for the collapse to spread across the Mediterranean. Letters from Ugarit describe the gradual realization that something was wrong, that help was not coming, that the networks were failing. There was time to see it happening, even if there was no ability to stop it. We are faster now. Our systems are more efficient, which means they are more fragile. We have optimized for performance, not resilience. We run global supply chains on just-in-time inventory systems that minimize waste and maximize profit, but cannot absorb shocks. We have cities that depend on food deliveries arriving every single day because we have no storage, no surplus, no buffer. When the massive supply chain disruptions of the early 2020s occurred, grocery stores ran out of toilet paper in days. When a single container ship blocked the Suez Canal in 2021, it stalled billions of dollars in trade and revealed how dependent we are on specific bottlenecks functioning perfectly. When microchip production slowed during the pandemic, car manufacturers could not build vehicles because modern cars require hundreds of chips and there's no alternative supply. These are not hypotheticals. These are warnings. These are small-scale systems failures that show us how fragile our interconnections are. The Bronze Age world collapsed when the rain stopped falling and the harvests failed and the trade networks seized up. We know this because stalagmites in caves preserve the chemical signature of that drought. We know this because clay tablets preserve the desperate letters of kings who could not help each other. We have the stereo image. You can see both what happened and how it felt. The question we face is whether we are building our own House of Yabninu. Whether we are writing letters that will never be sent, reaching out to networks that are already failing. Depending on systems that cannot survive the stresses we are placing on them, the Bronze Age did not collapse because people were ignorant or primitive. It collapsed because they had built a complex, sophisticated, interdependent civilization, and that civilization was not resilient enough to survive a sustained environmental crisis. The people of Ugarit were educated, literate, technologically advanced for their time. They had ships that crossed the Mediterranean. They had diplomatic networks that spanned continents. They had archives full of carefully recorded transactions and treaties. None of it saved them. The lesson of the Bronze Age collapse is not that civilization is impossible. Civilization clearly rebuilt. You are reading this because humans succeeded in creating new systems, new networks, new forms of organization. The Greeks recovered. Rome rose. The Mediterranean world became the foundation of Western civilization. The lesson is that complex systems fail. They fail when they are too rigid to adapt, too interconnected, to isolate failures, to optimize to absorb shocks. They fail when environmental stresses exceed their capacity to respond. They fail when the networks they depend on collapse and there is no alternative. And when they fail completely. The Mycenaeans did not just lose their palaces. They lost the ability to read and write. They lost 400 years of cultural development. They forgot who they had been. That tablet from the House of Yabninu, baked hard by the fire that destroyed Ugarit, survives because clay endures. The people who wrote it, who tried desperately to call for help that never came, are 3,000 years gone. Their city is buried ruins, their language is dead, their world ended. But the tablet remains, a whisper from ash, a warning across millennia. We should listen. The tablet from the House of Yabninu was never meant to be a monument. It was a utility, a desperate tool of a system that believed it was too large to fail. Today we look at the signature of dust in those ancient caves and we see a mirror. We see that civilizations aren't destroyed by a single blow, but by the slow unraveling of the threads that connect us. In 1200 BCE, those threads were copper and tin. Today, they are fiber optics and silicon. But the human heart at the center remains the same. Reaching out, writing letters, hoping the network still holds. The story of the Bronze Age collapse isn't just a record of what was lost. It's a masterclass in resilience for what comes next. Because even after the Great Silence, humanity found a way to speak again. We adopted new alphabets. We forged new metals. We rebuilt the world from the ash. If these echoes of forgotten lore have resonated with you today, I invite you to join our chronicle. Subscribe and hit the notification bell to ensure you're here for our next descent into the whispers of history. I want to hear from you in the comments. In our hyper-connected world of 2026, what is the one thread you think we cannot afford to lose? Your insights are what keep this community grounded in the present while we explore the past. Thank you for spending this time in the dust of Ugarit with me. Your support allows these stories to be told. Till the next whisper. Stay curious, stay safe.